Okay, so we are on Samach Zion Amud Beis, and we continue with the discussion. There's so many different nuances in the halacha of mashkin. What's lurking in the background is ribis, but ribis is not really the issue. It's a tangential issue right now for us. Obviously, the most of the parak deals with ribis, but here what's happening is that by giving a mashkin pledge, a collateral, then the question is how you pay it back, and is that payback look like ribis? So ribis is kind of there, but the focus is on mashkin. Now, last week we had a couple of interesting varieties on that, and then at the very end, the Gemara threw in that regardless of what you do, regardless of how you pay, a tzur v'derabanan, it's a Talmud Chacham, someone who is, goes beyond the pale, a little bit beyond the norm, he shouldn't do any of this. Why? Because even though it really is okay, there's not really a question of serious ribis here, but because there might be appearances. So a tzur v'derabanan, somebody who is a Talmud Chacham or a person who people look to, shouldn't do these things because it'll sort of confuse them and they'll think, oh, maybe it's okay. So we're going to start so where I want to start, I want to just review the last thing the Gemara said is, where is a tzur v'derabanan okay? In other words, where can a Talmud Chacham engage in such a pledge, if you will, and it would be okay? So there wouldn't be a chashash. So that's really the first point. So the Gemara answers, and this is about 8 or 10 lines from the top, is b'mashkanta desura, a mashkin, a collateral or a pledge of what they did in the town of Sura. Sura, we know, Sura Pompadisa were the two big centers of Torah. So mashkanta de Sura, the way they did it in Sura with the pledge, that would be okay. What did they do? The Kosev B'Hochim, because they wrote as follows: Mishlam Shania Ilay Kipak Ara Delo Kesa. They would make the following arrangement. They say, you're going to have this pledge, let's say for 3 years, 5 years, doesn't matter. And at the end of that, and you can eat the fruits, you can eat all the produce you want from that field. Now, of course, the produce isn't guaranteed. We don't know, but it's likely there will be produce because there's always been. But again, it's not 100%. But the deal is that at the end of this period, let's say 3 years, then the malveh, the lender who got this pledge from the borrower, will return it to the borrower and get no money back. So that's the essential thing here. So how could, so in other words, even for tzur v'derabanan, there's no chashash ribis, because the deal is that he's basically owning it for 3 years. Forget about the loan. He then pays it back. Now, if in the course of the 3 years he ate the same or more or less of the amount of the loan, that's irrelevant now, because basically he got a 3-year deal, and now after 3 years, the deal is complete and he goes away and there's no further payment. If there would be a further payment by the lovet to the malveh, that would then open the door to ribis. But if we say that he does not have to make any kind of repayment, whatever the malveh got out of it, he got out of it, then the Gemara says even tzur v'derabanan, even the most, the frumsta and the big Talmidei Chachamim would not have a problem of a chashash ribis in that case, because it doesn't enter into the picture. So that is a jumping off point for us because we're going to go from there. But that's how the Gemara concluded because there was this constant question: is there ribbis? Is there not ribbis? How do you repay? What do you do? So the Gemara says again definitively that in Surah they made this kind of arrangement, and therefore there was no shash ribbis, and even the servant of the Rabbanan is able to engage in such a deal. Okay, so now with that just sort of as a background, so now we're going to talk further about mashkanta. We're going to talk about a different nuance in mashkanta, in pledges on property. Rav Papa, Rav Huna, Bered, Rav Yeshua, Amar Rabbi, both of them came to the same conclusion. What did they say? Hi, mashkanta, regarding this mashkin, ba'asr de masalke. Now, last week we also spoke about a difference, in other words, and we see this today in our law as well. There were two different ways that a person could make a loan. A person either made a loan, let's say for a period of 3 years, and there was no opportunity to prepay. There was no such thing as prepayment. The 3 years had to go by, and then you got it back. On the other hand, there are, I guess, in certain communities, certain places, they give you the right of prepayment. And the right of prepayment means that if in the 3 years the lova has the money, he can go to the malva and says, here's your money, and I want my property back. So those are two distinct cases, and the halacha is different. So says the Gemara, Hai mashkanta, this collateral, ba'asra the misalke, in a place where misalke, the borrower can say to the lender, I am prepaying you, and therefore you have to leave my field. So now we're approaching this from a different standpoint. What are we talking about? The malva lends money to the lover, and he gets the field. Now, this malva had borrowed money from somebody else. So the malva himself has a creditor who, l'chayra, can go to the malva and take his nechasim, because that's the halacha. The halacha is that when you make a loan and you get a pledge, now the fact that the pledge is not 100% his, because it's really the mashkin from the love, the question, does this really enter into the picture? So now, see this. Says the Gemara, in a case where prepayment is allowed, that's what it's going to turn on. In a case where prepayment is allowed, then we say, Ein Baal Hachoiv Goy Vehemeno. The Baal Choiv, the creditor to the Malveh, cannot reach out into the Malveh's Nechasim and collect it. Now, the halacha is that a collateral survives death, so that if the Malveh owes money and he dies, then his nechasim, his heirs who get the property, are still subject to collection from the creditor. It doesn't die with the Malveh. That's generally the halakha. The Gemara here tells us that in a case where a prepayment is allowed, so in other words, at any point in time, the lover can come to the Malveh and say, I want my land back. Here's the money, I want my land back. So with that in mind, the creditor cannot then come later to the Malveh or his heirs and say, you owe me the land. So look what the Gemara is saying. The Gemara is saying that by virtue of the fact that there's no certainty in the Malveh's owning of the property, because it's not certain. The lover can come in and collect any point in time if he has the money. that triggers a halacha that the creditor then doesn't, even if it isn't yet exercised, the loaner hasn't exercised his right. But the fact that he has a right to come and collect the proper, to pay off and get the property back, that takes the creditor of the malva out of the picture because the ownership, let's say, is not 100% certain. So what do we see here? Even though this loan was only for a period of time, and after that period of time, the loan would be off. So it's not as if the Malva owns the property outright, loyal. He doesn't own it. He just has a loan for a fixed period of time. But the Gemara is telling us that if that fixed period of time can be upended by the Lova paying the Malva, then if in fact the Malva dies, there is no claim from the creditor because he doesn't have bilus. He doesn't own it. That's what the Gemara's Kiddush is. What else is Mechadesh? Also, in the case of prepayment, where prepayment is allowed, Ein HaBechor Nodel Pishnayim. Now we know that the Torah tells us that a Bechor gets double of what the other children get in Yerusha. Okay, so he's supposed to get double. Now, the question becomes, if the Malveh who has this possession dies, does the Bechor get Pishnayim? So you'll ask, why should he get Pishnayim? So again, we're going to see the chiluk between whether the Loveh can prepay or not prepay. If the Loveh can prepay, then it was never the totality of Rishus of the Malveh, and therefore his Yerush, his Bechor, has no rights to it because it doesn't belong to him. Now, I know what you're going to ask, but it doesn't belong to him even if he doesn't have the right of prepayment. But the Gemara wants to make a chiluk here that the right of prepayment changes the atmosphere. It changes the whole scenario of whether or not a person is considered a bilus, whether he's considered an owner, quote unquote, an owner, even though it's an owner for a specific period of time, or not. So the chiddush here is, once again, where prepayment is allowed, then the Bechor cannot get Pishnai. And the third thing that they said, Ba'alacha u'shvi is mishmata. And shvi is, if it comes to Shemitah, then if Shemitah comes in the middle of the period of time where this loan took place, then Shemitah wipes out the loan. Okay, again, prepayment is allowed. No prepayment has happened, but it's allowed in that place. So these halachas apply. And the third halacha is that Shemitah, which we normally know, Shemitah takes away any chayiv. So that's the case here. Now, in contrast,
question.
yeah,
Shemitah, and I always get this stuff confused, and it's of less relevance these days because we basically do a Prus Bowl that covers most things,
right,
and we're outside Israel, so the whole issue of the land and the produce doesn't apply, at least
right.
only minimally. We have to worry about certain things that come from Israel. But in theory, if I remember correctly, the whole issue with the Prus Bowl, and therefore really the whole issue of forgiveness of loans, is at the end of the Shemitah year, correct?
Correct.
So you have an interesting situation here. He buys, rather not buys, does the sole loan thing, let's say, in the fourth year of the cycle. Okay.
Right.
So the fourth year, the fifth year, and he's planning on having his, the original plan. He's going to pay back the fifth year, the sixth year, whatever, but it's open ended, and we see
Right.
different things happen. Fine. Fourth year, fifth year, sixth year, he's eating the produce, but he's also working. He's working the land, and only this guy can actually eat the produce, and so on. Fine. The seventh year, Shemitah, he comes along and he can't actually work the land, but let's say it's fruit trees they're going to produce anyway, etc. Fine. Anybody and everybody could come along and take produce during that year because it's Shemitah year, and yet the loan though doesn't actually get forgiven until the end of the year. See, we have the different timing of different pieces of this, which I
Right.
find interesting. I don't know if it matters much, but I find that interesting.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's right. So in other words, it's at the end of the Shemitah year, so that so yeah, anybody can come because it's Hefker, but the
Yeah,
chov that
it's
he
still,
has,
still,
that's what we're
they
talking
don't
about.
get the
And
land,
that debt
anybody.
is um what Shemitah takes away
Right.
because again, in this circumstance, because he didn't really have control of the land.
Right.
So we're going to see the contrast in a minute. Good morning, Jay.
Uh,
Now,
excuse me
Rabbi,
for being late.
yeah, David.
Rabbi, can I ask a couple questions to
Yeah, sure, man.
clarify? So, you are pledging the property. In all cases of pledging the property as a security interest, does that give the lender the right to use the land, or is
Yes,
it possible to have a security interest without the right to use the land?
right. So we're talking about where he has a right to the land, where he
Okay.
has a right to.
All right. So the security interest provides him with that ability during the entire period until if there's a prepayment option, then he prepays it immediately. That ability to use the land ceases upon payment of the loan.
Correct, correct.
Um, and that is right at that moment, correct? He doesn't
Yeah,
have the
at
right,
the moment that he prepays, then it cuts off.
and he has the right to work the land because it's a security interest. That is, the lender has the right to work the land during the entire period
Right,
until it's paid off.
right.
Okay. I just wanted to
So Michael, what that can lead to is that the fellow works the land, works the land, works the land, and now he's about to get the pay risk, and the guy prepays.
but that's his risk. I mean, he
That's
doesn't
his,
have to,
that's
that's his
right.
risk.
That's
I
his
mean,
risk because he may not get anything for it.
see, it's the security interest. I mean, in today's world, we don't necessarily, I mean, we look at it different. We look at it as the land is security for the loan. If you don't pay the loan, you default on the loan, then I have the right under certain circumstances to possess the land.
Right,
I don't have the right to work the land, but I have the right to possess the land during that time period. In other words, it's not as if it's I'm assigning this to you until I can pay. It is a last ditch effort. If I can't pay, then you can,
get the land.
take the land. So
Right,
in olden times, in Talmudic times, it was a very different perception of what collateral is. I mean, collateral is, you're giving me the right, for the loan. So you're gaining from that. It's not really a loan at that point. You're gaining from the ability to secure the loan. So you
right,
have that right. And that to me is like interest, because the only reason you're securing that is in the event you don't pay. So why, I mean, I know we're going back a ways, but I'm just thinking about this in Ribbis. Why should he have the right to use all that? I know it's granted in the agreement,
right.
but is that the only reason? Because he's getting a gain that he wouldn't otherwise get. It's a loan.
Right. Okay. So two things. Number one, the risk that the malva takes by taking the collateral is he'll get paid, but he may get nothing from the fruit at all. The property may never yield anything, in which case, if you remember what we've said multiple times, that if this is, what is Rubis Katsutsa? I lend you $100, you pay me 110. There's a certainty in that, an absolute certainty, and that makes it Ribis. Once you get away from certainty, now it starts becoming a gray area. Is it Ribis? Because I didn't contract with you to take back fruit on top of the property. I have the property, and there's some yield to the property, and because I quote unquote own it for that period of time, I'm allowed to take the fruit. Now, again, the Tzurva D'Rabbanan would not. You do this. You're right. That's what we started by saying, that the Tzurva D'Rabbanan would go beyond and say, no, you can't do it.
Right.
But for the common person who is not, in that category, then you're allowed to take it. And again, the risk is that you're going to do all this work and get nothing, because it's all about timing. It's all about timing.
But it's not your right. You're lending, and this is a security interest to ensure that if the loan is not paid, you get payment for it in another way.
Right.
So really, the lender doesn't have, I mean, if the idea of lending is to help your fellow, then you really should not get any return, if you will, for lending. You should have it as security. The borrower should be able to work his own land and not seed the produce during the years that the loan is outstanding. And then when he repays the loan, fine. If he doesn't repay the loan by the specified time period, then he procures the land, and that is the deal, because you're not supposed to make anything on that. I mean, to me,
right. So if you remember a few weeks ago when we had a discussion on a similar subject of what do you do with the payers, there was three versions. One is that the lender can take it. One, that it really belongs to the borrower. And third is that it's suspended. In other words, the middle of the road was you take it, you sell it, and then you see what happens. That's where, in a case where the property might be able to convey from one to the other. And since you don't know, then you don't allow it. So, but here, we're considering it to be a sale. See, the whole chap of why it's not considered ribis is because when you look at a deal like this, you say, you know what? It's a sale. It's not a loan. And once you determine that it's a sale with rights of payback, then there's no ribis on a mechira. There's no ribis on a sale.
But see, it's not a sale. I mean,
no, in reality, Michael, it's not. I agree with you, it's not. But for appearance purposes, the Chachamim say, you know what? We can interpret this as being a sale, and that's what they often do. In order to avoid ribis, you say, wait a minute, this is a sale with the right of a payback. So that takes out of ribis. You're not wrong by saying that if it's a loan, then how could he take it and everything else? And we say it's a gray area, so we're allowing him, but it sort of doesn't do it. But if you say that the actual event turns into a sale, then the whole parsha of ribis goes away. So I know it's a strain.
Be a sale.
But you have to, yeah.
I mean, I know I sound like a broken record, but I mean, that is a security interest. It is to entice the lender to make the loan, but he's not supposed to gain the lender is not supposed to gain anything on it. The Lova needs to operate as though he is operating normally. So he should be able to use that field and secure the produce. Because if you make it a sale, then there's no loan. There's no such thing as a loan. It's a sale. And then, it's either or. But what I view this is as, you won't lend me the money because you're not convinced I'll take it back. I'll tell you what, I'll put up my land in the event I don't pay you back, but only then will you have a right to it. You're right. If he's got to use it right now, then it's a sale. Then let's not call it a loan. Let's call it a sale. And the agreement should be that a sale. And if you want a right of repurchase, you can have a right of repurchase. But it just doesn't make sense.
But also, there's one other factor, Michael, and that is that the parties themselves agree. The Lova says you can take the produce of the field during this period of time, and you're not obligated to me. So inherent in this, that's an inherent understanding is that the love is not going to pursue the malva later and say, you stole my property by eating the produce during the period of the loan,
But that sure looks like
because it's
ribbis, Rabbi.
understood. It's
All right.
understood.
So here's an interesting comparison.
Yeah,
We have a very clear halacha that if you loan money to if a poor person borrows money from you and you take his clothing as collateral, you have to give
right.
it back for the night or day, whichever
Night
the
and
part
day,
of
right.
time that he actually needs the clothing, you have to give back. You can only use it, hold it even the time when he
But he
doesn't
doesn't use
need
it.
it.
He's not using it.
And yet here we're saying this land, I mean, this is his family plot of land, and it's the only thing he had to give as collateral, and yet you're now saying,
But he's not in the category of a poor person who then should have rights to the land because he doesn't have anything else. I mean, so it's not a complete comparison.
Well,
right, but I'm saying, what about, I mean, if a poor person, okay, he wants to get to the point of, he doesn't want to get to the point of having to give his shirt off his back as collateral. He has this land, and he needs the money because he needs the money to do stuff and maybe invest in a business, whatever, to try to get himself, move up.
Yeah.
And yet now you're taking, he's got this tiny little orchard with a few olive trees, and he can't even use those olives because
he's
the other because
totally illiquid, Rabbi.
the
So
lender has it.
you know, let's call him house poor. I mean, he's got
Yeah,
this piece of land. He
right,
has no other liquidity,
right.
and he's in that situation,
Yeah.
and he needs to it. So it's a security. It just seems like if he agrees to that, and that the malva requires that he get access to the produce during the period of the loan, it seems like ribbis.
Yeah. So again, you're not wrong, Michael, but there's a couple of factors that go into this. One, of course, is the fact that again, it's different in the time of the Gemara maybe than today, but they commonly, in order to get around ribbis, remember, ribbis is a serious thing. So when the Chachamim can find sort of a loophole, if you will, to say this is not ribbis because of this, then we lean in that direction. So one of the ways you get around ribbis is by saying it's a sale. Okay, it's a sale over a period of time, and then with a right of repurchase, and therefore ribbis doesn't even apply. That's commonly what the Chachamim do. But also, if the borrower, not in your case, Menashe, of a poor person, but if the borrower says, listen, I'm giving you this land. I have a right to repurchase at any point in time, but in the meantime, you enjoy the produce of the land. So in other words, there isn't a contention here as to whether or not he should have a right to the land. He's giving up any right to the land by just saying, it's not my land. I know that you have the control of the land for that period of time, and therefore, and again, the fact that there was some risk as to whether or not there would be produce or not is an important factor. If there's a guaranteed certainty, we might look at it differently. But even in the case where land produces, there maybe it was overused. Maybe the land, wasn't, it didn't lie fallow or whatever, so it didn't have much by way of produce. He gets nothing. That's a risk he takes. So, and the Gemara tells us when there is a risk of whether or not someone will get something definitive, then you can't have ribbis. Now, certainly not ribbis deraisa, but even ribbis derabanan also has to have some basis as to why you say it's ribbis. And we're saying that here we have enough of a gray area that it's not even ribbis derabanan. It's not even it doesn't qualify as ribbis because of those rights. Anyway, so that's how the Gemara presents it. But the focal point of this discussion is what rights are there when the borrower has a right to prepay? And we'll see how important that is. So let's go a little bit further. But there are places where there is absolutely no right of prepayment, meaning that the lender knows he has this property unequivocally for a period of time, let's say for 3 years, because there's no prepayment possibility. Now, look, then the converse is true. Now, if the lender had a Baal Choiv, if the lender had himself a creditor to whom he owed money, then that creditor has rights to that land, and he has rights to that land even if the lender, in other words, he has rights to that land even if the lender dies and leaves it to his children as an estate. That creditor has rights because creditors' rights in the Torah are inviolate. In other words, you can't. There is a chilek, and I don't want to get into it now, but there's a chilek. Land is considered, and we've talked about this, sort of the ultimate. Land is land. Nobody wants to lose land. Everybody wants land. Is kayach. When you have produce to the land, that's a different story, because produce of the land isn't the same as land itself. But in the case of where a person has ownership, certain ownership for a period of time, it's his. No question, it's his. Now the creditor has rights to that land because he's taking land from someone who borrowed money from him, and this is his collateral. So therefore, under this circumstance, the Baal Chayiv can collect it even from the Arshin, because we say that the Chayiv survives his death, and therefore he can collect it. Now, Ubchor Nadal Pishnayim. Now, for the same reason that we're saying the Baal Chov, the creditor can take it, now the firstborn is going to say to his siblings, you know what? This belongs to our father. Okay? It's his, albeit for a period of time, but it's his. Once it's his, I have a right to Pishnayim, because
But what's he going to do with that? It's just an idea. He can't do anything with the Pishnayim.
No, he's going to say that he has that land now becomes to him. He can farm it. He can do whatever he wants. I mean, in other words, it's his land. It's not now the land of all the family to be divided equally. It's
Why
his.
not?
It's his
Why shouldn't-
Pishnayim. It's his right of what is called primogeniture. In other words, he has the right of inheritance over and above the other siblings. That's the idea of Pishnayim. So now that the Malveh owns this land, it's his, can't be taken away from him. You see, look at the chilek. Now Pishnayim works, and the ain't Shvius Mishmata, and Shvius doesn't take away the land. We said before that Shvius at the end of 7 years for a loan, it goes away. Once again, why? Because we're considering it to be a mechira. We're considering it to be an absolute sale over that period of time, and Shemitah has nothing to do with the sale. So because there's a certainty, the Gemara is, these Mandamar of Papa and Rav Huna Ber Rav Yeshua are saying that look at the chilek between having the right to prepay and not having the right to prepay, and how that sort of mushrooms into all other kinds of halachas. So this is a Gemara that's different from what we've been talking about, because our primary focus has been the mashkin itself and what the rights are. Here we see that once a mashkin takes root in the ownership of the malveh, then it's his. It's his, and there's no question that he is the balabos. So that's how the Gemara wants to make the chilek between prepaying and not prepaying. Now there may be other issues as well. The Gemara doesn't go into it, but these are three different categories that the Amoraim are talking about, whether it's collecting a chayiv, or whether it's inheritance, or whether it's shmita. These are all different areas of halacha, and what it's trying to show us that in all areas of halacha, there is a bottom line, and it's the same bottom line, that ownership is ownership, but if it's temporary because of prepayment right, we don't consider it ownership, and therefore you have limited use of it. You can't sort of run the table and say, oh, I'm going to give it to my child for Pishnayim or this, that, and the other. There is a chilik in the eyes of the Gemara as to whether or not there is complete bias, whether it's not bias. And that's the chilik that the Gemara wants to make.
Rabbi, does that mean that it is?
Michael, can you speak up a little bit?
I'm sorry, I'm a little hoarse.
Better.
I'm confused because if there's a prepayment, are you saying that if there is an inducement for prepayment, that it is considered a loan and not a sale, but if there's not, it's a sale and not a loan?
You can look at it that way, yes. In other words, it doesn't vest. We have the term vesting. So it doesn't vest in the lender because there's this uncertainty of whether or not over that period of time the love is going to pay. Once there's an uncertainty, there's a cloud, then we can't say with absolute that the lender owns it. He only owns it as long as the lova doesn't have a whim. If the lova gets money and says, I want it back, I've got to give it to him. So
if there's a prepayment provision, are you saying that the lova doesn't have rights to the produce?
That's correct. That's correct.
So
right.
That's more like a loan.
Right.
And it's a security interest.
Current interest.
So the Gemara is differentiating explicitly between a prepayment right and no prepayment right.
Prepayment right. And in a no prepayment right, there is a high degree of bias, in other words, ownership. So therefore, we can say that what goes with ownership, inheritance goes with ownership, responsibility to a debtor goes with ownership. In other words, the things that go with ownership apply when there's no prepayment right, because then you could look at it and say, this fellow owns the property. There's no question for 3 years, 5 years, whatever it is. That property is in his reshus. And as long as it's in his reshus and there's no way it can come out, then we say that these halachas apply. So that's an interesting perspective here.
Is that the halacha, Rabbi? Is that the halacha? Is that the halacha?
That's the halacha. The halacha is that ownership. Now, again, today we have other mechanisms that sort of intervene or control. Like in the case we see, like Menashe mentioned, for Shemitah we have a prusbul. So we do have other mechanisms today that the halacha imputes into these kinds of circumstances. But certainly in the time of the Gemara, where they didn't have that, they had to go purely by the look of it. And the look of it, in the case of a no prepayment, was clear ownership. Now, mind you, that Tzurva D'Rabbanan wouldn't touch that, because even in the case of 100% ownership, the Tzurva D'Rabbanan in the very back of their mind say, like you said, Michael, wait a minute, is this really 100% kosher? Isn't there the slightest doubt that maybe something is not right here? So, and why do they say that? Because if you remember what we said at the very beginning, that the only way that Tzurva D'Rabbanan can make a deal is if there is no at the end of the deal, there's no further exchange of money or produce. In other words, it's self-contained within the period of the loan. That's the only way even the Tzurva D'Rabbanan would allow it. Our case isn't like that. In our case, there are prepayments. So the idea is whenever there is not a prepayment, there is a reimbursement. Whenever there's a reimbursement, according to the Tzurva say that smacks of ribbis. It's not really ribbis, but it smacks of ribbis because someone is going to say, and you, Michael, will say it, wait a minute, he's getting a benefit here. He loaned $100 and he's getting back his 100, but he's also getting 50 in produce. So the chayra, that looks like ribbis. Now, if you say that it's a sale, so there's no ribbis, Okay, it's a sale. The Tzurba Rabbanan might not go along with that, but at least you can say honestly, there was no loan here, and Ribis doesn't apply in a sale. But you can't say it was a sale in any circumstance, at least reasonably, if there's a prepayment option. Prepayment option takes it out of the category of being a sale Lamafreya at the very beginning. You can't even contemplate that it was a sale because it's clearly a short-term, maybe, proposition. Here, take my land, I'll use the money, but if I get a windfall or I make a business or something else. So that doesn't even look like a sale, Michael. The other looks like a sale because for the period of time that they have the agreement, it's inviolate. And that is what the Chazal are telling us. Now, you could say, but it's not a sale, but the Chazal are telling us that we can interpret it to be a sale for purposes of ribis. Now, why do we do that? Again, part of the reason is because we want to avoid ribis, no question about it. So when there is a way to avoid ribis, we'll hang our hat on that and say, oh, it was a sale, it's not ribis. Now, we can argue, is it a sale, is not a sale? That's a different discussion. But the Amoraim, and certainly at the time, they wanted to avoid any appearance of ribis, so they interpreted things differently so that there was no chashash ribis. So, but it's an interesting Gemara because the Gemara is telling us how you look at deals, whether it's a temporary deal or now, even in the case of prepayment, he may never prepay it. He may only pay it at the end of that 3-year period. But because he has the right of prepayment, it takes it out of bilis. It takes it out of ownership. And therefore, anybody who wants to attack that malveh, whether it's a bechor or it's a loan or whatever, you can't attack him because it's not his. It's sort of hanging on a thread. And on the thread, we're not going to allow them to take it. So that is the situation with regard to that halacha. Now, the Gemara is going to go on. Remember, we're looking at all different types of. It's like a prism. I mean, how many sides does a prism have? I don't know, 50, 80. So every side has a different sort of nuance to the halacha. So we just got through saying that on a pledged property, there's a chilik between a fixed deal or a prepaid deal. So now the Gemara goes a step further. Sutra says the name of Rav Papa. Hi Mashkanta. Okay. Someone pledges a property. Now, again, Ba'asa de Misalke, we're continuing with the same thought. In a place where the deal is not totally set because prepayment is allowed, Misalkele, then he can evict him. Now, to your question, Michael, what about the produce? So, afilu mitamre the abuda, that what they used to do is they used to, because it's hard to just go around and I guess collect, in this case, dates, could be anything, if they would fall down from the tree. So what they did, they would put baskets under the trees, and as the fruit would naturally fall, becomes heavy and falls, it would fall into the basket. Now, why is that important? Because you're going to see in a minute that there's a halacha of the basket. The basket has a separate halacha. Okay, so in this particular case, where prepayment was allowed, and he prepaid him. And you're going to say, wait a minute. And he prepaid him. The malva in this case worked the field, and now he's getting the produce. So the produce should be his, based on what we said before. Says the Gemara, no. That the moment he says that he makes the prepayment, make or say, the moment he makes the prepayment, then anything in that basket now belongs to the loveh. Even though it's been falling even before he said it, But the minute he says it, then then he can't collect from the basket anymore because it's not his. Now, v'agvana b'sisone. Now, what about? Okay, so in other words, we're going to see in a minute that there are halachas having to do with these baskets. So in this particular case, we're saying the basket does nothing. But if he made a hagbah, which right, a kinyan hagbah, which we know is a valid kinyan, if he made a kinyan hagbah, then then he owns it. So the Gemara here is making a chilik that if you are allowed to prepay, and we say that there is, continuing with what we said before, there's no absolute ownership on the part of the malveh, so he can enjoy it. During the period of time that it's his, he can enjoy it. The minute the loveh says, here's your $100, then there's a cutoff at that point in time, and it's like it's frozen. Whatever is there on the field does not belong to the malveh anymore because it literally like it was cut off. The exception, says the Gemara, is if he made a hagbah. If, let's say, he made hagbah with that basket, then even though the loveh says, here's your money, the malveh is allowed to take it because he made a kinyan. So this, now we're going to go into kinyanim. So in other words, the kinyan hagbah is itself a stronger halacha than the halacha here of stopping him from eating the fruit, which may or may not be ribis. But in other words, the kinyan hagbah supersedes. That's what he wants to say. Okay, but Lamanda Omar Kilev Shalokeach B'Shus Moicher Kana Lokeach. Okay, but according to the Manda Omar, who says this is a different halacha, a kli of a lokeach, meaning a buyer, but it could be a borrower. The kli of a buyer, B'Shus Moicher, which sits in the rishus of a moicher kana lokeach. In other words, I'll draw a simple comparison. We have an embassy in London. Is that English property or is it American property? It's American property. Why? Because we consider it's inviolable that if we own property in another country, then it belongs to us. So along the same line, what we're saying is here, the lokeach, the buyer, has a receptacle in the rishus of the moicher, and you would think, wait a minute, so the moicher should have control over that. It's in my property. But there's a Manda Omer who says, kana lokeach, that it belongs to the buyer. And that is even without kinyan hagbah. So here we want to introduce and say kinyan hagbah gives someone a right to produce, even if it's produce that should otherwise be taken away from him. Because why? Because there was a payment. Still, the hagbah helps. But there's another Manda Omer who says you don't need kinyan hagbah when the kli is in the rishus, even if it's not his rishus, it's in the rishus of the mocher, then the kona kli. So then we say afilu delo agbana b'sinase konanu. So even if he didn't make hagbah, that's okay. So now we learn a different halacha, right? Because and there's a term for this because according to this, normally we have different types of kinyanim. So we say that we have a kinyan hagbah. Now, in this particular case, we say this becomes a kinyan kli, not often used, but a kinyan kli means that I have a kli in that automatically is mine. That's why I use the embassy comparison, because it's mine. It doesn't have to be in my rishus. Anything in that kli, no matter how it gets there, is mine. So according to this Manda Omar, a kinyan kli is enough. You don't need a kinyan hagbah a Kenyan Kli is enough to say that the buyer or the borrower, whoever it happens to be, has rights. In other words, there's rights to that. In this particular case, would be the mocher when the lokeach pays him back, and the mocher it cuts off immediately. So, according to one man d'Omer, you have to have a Kenyan hagbah, otherwise the receptacle he doesn't hold from Kenyan Kli. He says that if it falls into a Kli, but you didn't make hagbah, no good. It's not yours. But there's a man d'Omar who says, yes, Kenyan hagbah is very important, but we have something called the Kenyan Kli, and the Kenyan Kli allows us to supersede ownership and say that that it belongs to him. So this is a different nuance on the halacha of
Rabbi, I'm very confused. So, we said before, if there's a prepayment allowance, it's considered as a loan.
right.
And I have real trouble with the term lokeach in the case of a lender of a true loan, because he's taking the love is the owner of that property. If there's
Right.
a prepayment option, we said before that that's considered a loan, not a sale. So how does the malva have any right to that produce at any point in time? Because we've said it's the love's property. If there's a prepayment, if the prepayment option, of course he's going to want to prepay early so that he can get that. So how does the malva enter into this to be able to take the produce?
Right. So again, this is where the Chazal tell us that in order for, again, we want to make, we want commerce. We want people to lend money and borrow money. Otherwise, there would never be any deal. There would never be any deal because the lender would always be so constricted that he says, wait a minute, I can't take ribis, but there are some benefits I should have for making this loan. So we have to, Mike, we have to think of it in terms of a business deal. That yes, it's a mitzvah to lend money. Okay, fine, you do the mitzvah and you don't collect ribis. So there's no ribis here. But in the course of the dealing, there may be produce, there may be fruits. So the Gemara tells us, you know what? We're not going to, as long as he's in control of that property, we're going to give him certain rights to the fruit. And therefore, again, servitor runner wouldn't do this, but the common person would do this and say, okay, so now I have something for my efforts, for my giving up the money, for my making the loan, I get something. The Chazal allow leeway. In other words,
that's the antithesis of what a loan is for, is to get something off of it. That's what ribis is. You're not supposed to acquire anything. You're lending your friend the money. That's the mitzvah of the Torah, to lend him money. You shouldn't be taking anything.
Right. But one of the exceptions to ribis, which we've said before, is the uncertainty of whether or not there would be anything to be gotten. If there is a certainty, that's ribis. Certainty is ribis. Just like, and I'm going to go back to a while back when we had the view of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that even ribis gomer, even absolute ribis, if there's an alternative to paying, then that ribis gomer, that absolute ribis goes away. What does that mean? In other words, if you go one way and it's 100% ribis, you violate a halacha of the Torah. But if you had an alternative to that ribis gomer, then the fact that you had an alternative says he's mekel. Rabbi Yehuda's mekel, and he says the ribis gomer no longer is ribis because you could have gone a different way. So what does that tell us? Again, remember the whole concept. Ribis, the severity of ribis is something we want to avoid. As much as possible, we want to get away from saying something is ribis. So we start with the proposition that we're not going to want it to be ribis. Now, if you overcome that proposition and you show it's ribis, then it's ribis. It's not the other way around. It's not ribis and then we undo it. we don't want something to be ribis. So we want to interpret that when two people enter into a business arrangement, they're not doing ribis. They're not doing ribis. Unfortunately, they fall into the trap because it is ribis. There's no question that it's ribis. I lend you $100 and you give me $10. There's no way of how can I say it's not ribis? Of course it's ribis. But here, forget about ribis katsutza. We're not talking about ribis deraisa. Even ribis derabanan has a certain gray area. And I know it's a hard thing to conceptualize, Michael, but you want to take the position that anything that lender gets out of the property should be ribis. And I'm telling you that if there was a certainty that he would get something out of the property, I could argue and say, yes, it should be ribis. I would agree with you. But because there is a hava amina, minute as it might be, that he will not get anything from that property, in which case it's a straight loan and a state repayment. The fact that something comes out of that property, whether it's a little or a lot, is no longer ribis because uncertainty takes it out of the parsha of ribis. That's the important concept here to keep in mind, is that ribis has to be absolute. And even ribis d'Rabbanan, again, we can argue ribis d'Rabbanan there's certain latitudes, but in the case where someone in the case where someone has the right to prepay, okay, there we make a chilek. In the case where someone has the right to prepay, then in that particular situation, the lender doesn't really have control of the property. So it's not as if it's my property and I'm taking something from it.
So the Gemara keeps trying to say, look, we got to find a way so it won't be ribis.
That's correct.
That's the attitude of the whole chachma that we're going through here.
That's the whole Gemara. The whole Gemara.
Our job is to find a way to say that it's not ribis. Period.
That's the objective. The word you have it correct.
But you just said, Rabbi, in a case where there's a prepayment option, then the lender cannot take a claim to anything on the property because he's going to he has the right to prepay it. It's his land. You don't have a right to it. Now, it seems like you're going against that, and what this Mandamar describes is that even with that, you can go and take the produce during the period before the prepayment. But, at the moment he pays, he has no rights to anything, and it goes back to the low.
Even if the fruit is already in the basket, so to speak. Yes.
Right. But that's why I don't understand why there's a hagbah or a kli, because this is the property of the lovet. I mean, he's just securing the loan with his property, and he's made it very clear that that's for lending purposes. And it's only if he fails to pay does that become the possession. So I don't understand how you could allow any leeway in that.
So this is what this Gemara is introducing. That, to your point, you're 100% right. The minute he says, here's your money, it's a cutoff. Says the Gemara that there's an exception to that cutoff, either with a kinyan hagbah. If you made a kinyan hagbah, then even the cutoff doesn't remove the property, the fruit from the.
So during the period of the loan, he goes out to the field and he says that this basket is my.
It makes a hagbah,
and it's my produce, and that he acquires that portion, even though it's only a loan at that point. But
that's correct.
Say it's his.
Right now, the lover comes along and says, "Here's your $100. Don't touch that basket." He says, "What do you mean, don't touch that basket? I made a kinyan hagbah on that basket." So the halacha is the kinyan hagbah supersedes the prepayment. Now the Gemara says there is a Manda Amar who says you don't need hagbah. That kinyan kli is enough. The fact that my basket is in your property, because remember now the lender's basket is now in the borrower's property because he paid it back. He paid it back. So it's now back to his property. But that Manda Omer says that the kinyan kli allows him to take the fruit even after the payback, because the minute it fell into that basket, even without Hagbah, the Kli makes the Kinyan. That's a different approach. It's a Kinyan Kli rather than a Kinyan Hagbah. So again, these are the, how shall I say it? You have the halachas, and we want to sort of see a consistency in the halachas. And Michael, I think part of the problem is you don't see the consistency. So we want to have a consistency in the halacha as much as we can. But Jay, to your point, we're constantly looking for that minute situation where the halacha doesn't necessarily give an absolute. We're constantly looking for that. What is a kinyan hagbal? That's a way of getting out of the situation. What's a kinyan kli? It gets us out of the situation of an absolute that he can't touch the fruit, because under those circumstances, once you pay back, literally at that moment, you no longer have bias.
Everything changes the minute you pay.
What's that?
Every issue that we discussed changes the minute he gives him the money to pay it back.
Correct.
Everything goes
Rabbi,
back
if you're making hagbah, that means you have a right to it, which means
it's yours. No, when you made the hagbah, it's yours already, Michael. It's yours. You made the hagbah, it's yours.
So then that's a sale and not a loan. So it goes back to what the rabbi said, is
right.
that it's not a loan, it's a sale. But I can't.
No. Even in a loan, we're saying now that even in a loan, there is the possibility of a kinyan that allows the lender to be able to control. Again, it goes back to the whole question, la halacha, whether or not in the case of the loan, you're allowed to take any produce at all. So we're trying to find a way to say, yes, you can take some produce and it would not be violating ribbis, notwithstanding the tzur of the Rabbanan. For us common folk, this is an allowable form of business. The Chazal say we don't want to completely tie the hands of the lender so that he's like in a straitjacket. He can't do a thing. He lends the $100 and he can't do a thing. So we give some leeway for him to enjoy the benefits, and at the same time not have it to be ribbis. But in a circumstance, but then the Gemara wants to make a chilik and say that there is a circumstance where we're even going to take that loan and turn it into a sale so that there's no question that he has full control of it. If it's a loan, I cannot take your position, Michael. It's a loan. How does he allow it and everything else? But if there's no prepayment allowed, then it takes it out of the whole parsha of a loan and becomes a sale. And ribbis can never happen on a sale. So I know it's kind of, I don't want to say it's a fiction, but it's the Chazal wanting to, the whole purpose of the Gemara and of the approach of the Chazal is not to make it harder, but to make it easier. This we know from many discussions in the past, that whenever, and even Poskim always want to find a way to leverage something that it shouldn't be strict. Okay, there are times when you can't, but we're always trying to find. Rabbi Moshe was very famous about this, but you always want to find a way. Is there something in this that can allow us? I remember one time I had a discussion with Rabbi Einemer, we were talking about a business matter, which on the face of it looked like it would be problematic. But the further we discussed, it became clear that there were certain pratim, there were certain parts of the deal that can be interpreted one way or the other. If you interpreted one way, then the business deal was problematic. If you interpreted it another way, then it's not problematic. And therein lies the halacha, is that when you can interpret it in a way. Now, you can interpret it the other way. I'm not going to say you can't, But since you can interpret it the other way, which makes it more lenient or more allowable, Chazal say that's the way you should do it. We were put on this earth here to be strict constructionists. We were given the opportunity to follow the mitzvahs, and if there's no ambiguity, there's no ambiguity. Unfortunately, with many of the things in our lives, there's ambiguity. And that's where, these discussions come in. Now, these are Talmudic discussions, and we know that sometimes the halacha later changes. It's not the way the Gemara posits it. But certainly, the way the Gemara presents this is it just wants to show us, look at the different halachas that come into play here. You have the halacha of potential ribis. You have a mashkanta, a collateral, which has certain halachas. Now you have a halacha of kinyan hagbah, and now you have a halacha of kinyan kli. So the question is, there's now a clash of all of this. How do we make sense of it? So this is how the Gemara wants to sort of play it out and say, in the normal course, when you can prepay, then there is no buy list, there's no ownership on the part of the lender or the seller. There's no buy list at all. Therefore, there's a certain approach. But once he prepays, then all bets are off. Oh, wait a minute. All bets are not off. If he made it a hagbah, then that hagbah supersedes the buyer's statement, here's your money. According to Abba Mandamer, Kinyan Kli does the same thing. So you can't say with absolute certainty that once he prepays, it's over, because it's not over. If there was something that happened in the intervening time and that created a kinyan of some kind, that kinyan supersedes what we said before. That's what makes this so, you have to sort of look at it in many different ways. Now, we're going to, Mitch, next week, we're going to talk about other kind of kinyanim, but kinyanim, like a kinyan kli or a kinyan hagbah, make, like, what do we do on Pesach when we sell our chametz? What do we do? We're selling our chametz. I mean, you have to have some consideration. So we say a kinyan hagbah. There is such a thing. Chazal established a kinyan hagbah that I can transfer ownership with a verbal agreement with a hagbah of an item, a handkerchief or whatever it happens to be. You look at me and say, what are you kidding me? What's going on here? There's no money that exchanged hands. There's no real consideration, which we say we need in a deal. The teretz is that the halachas allow for certain, I'll call it loopholes, for certain loopholes in the halacha, that even with something that seems straightforward and it is a halacha, and it's inviolate. Wait a minute, it's not inviolate. There's certain ways of getting around the halacha. Now, if they didn't make a kinyan, then all the produce that's on the field belongs to the borrower, not the lender. It doesn't belong to him, because the minute he pays, there's a cutoff. The question is whether there was something prior to the cutoff that allowed the lender to have the benefits. And that's what this Gemara is introducing to us as a chiddush, that in a case where you're allowed to prepay, now it may be different otherwise, but in a case where you're allowed to prepay, and therefore it should be inviolate, no, it's still allowed because of various kinyanim, kinyan hagbah, kinyan kli, whatever it happens to be. So again, this is a different part of the halacha dealing with mashke. That's why I say it's like a prism. Every side of the prism has a different halacha and a different approach. And this Gemara goes, again, ribis is the overarching concern, always. But in these cases, we're saying it doesn't come to ribis because we're allowing certain benefits, and therefore ribis doesn't apply. The question is, forgetting about ribis, what's the relationship between the borrower and the lender, and when is he allowed to have it? Not because of a ribis, but because it would be stealing. If he took the produce after he's no longer allowed to take it, it's not ribis, then it's theft. The Gemara will talk about it. It's theft. So in order to avoid any of that, this way the Gemara gives us a straight proposition that the borrower is in control As long as he hasn't paid, the lender has rights. Once he's paid, then the rights stop in that moment, except the exceptions that we talked about, different kinyanim. So anyway, so this will go on. We'll continue to talk about different aspects of kinyanim. And again, we're going to see all different. We have two totally different parshas here on kinyan as to whether or not you're allowed to do certain things. In the case of before, we said we can pishnayim and other things, or whether you can actually take the fruit once a deal is over because there's a loophole that allows it. All right. So, but Michael, I know we struggle with this question because it appears that no matter how you look at it, you're going to want to say he's gaining a benefit, and that benefit is ribbis, right, Michael? That's your major concern. Is that there is the appearance of ribbis. So what we're trying to say is there's no longer appearance of ribbis. Again, in the whole principle of halacha, the fact that he has something out of this property, the Chazal will not penalize him. This is sort of the fine line. The Chazal will not penalize him and say it's ribbis under certain circumstances. Again, Tzurva the Rabbanan won't touch it because you're right. From the Tzurva the Rabbanan's perspective, they take your view, Michael. It looks like ribbis. It looks like ribbis. But in the norm, what we're saying is the norm, meaning in everyday commerce, situations like this are not ribbis, and therefore there are certain rights and obligations, and here the Gemara is presenting them to us.
Well, Michael must be a descendant of one of the Rabbanim who had this view way back when the arguments took place initially.
Michael, I think Michael is sort of the Rabbanim.
I don't like inconsistency. I like people to be consistent in what they say. If you're lending, you're lending. You don't have a right to anything, and you're lending it because it's a zechus to you to have the mitzvah of lending to somebody else, that you have the ability to do that. And so if you take it along the way, you happen produce along the way, it's just not the same.
So we're weaving a garment here that has stitches that say this you can't do, and then you're right. In black and white, you're right. In black and white, there should be no difference. It's either it is or it isn't. There shouldn't be any gray area. The problem is that halacha has gray area, and as long as there's ways of looking at it, again, to give some benefit, leniency, if you will, we'll take that approach and we'll say that that's okay. For the most part, there's no violation of halacha. It may not be the ultimate way to go. Like you say, Michael, the ultimate way to go is to say black or white. That's the Tzurva Rabbanan is black and white. But in the course of halacha, all of the Gemaras, everything that we learn has to do with, I won't say human relations, but it has to do with how people interact with other people, how they interact with in the case of Bava Metzia, or in the case of Bava Basra, or in the case of different Masechtas. It's always about the relationship that people have to people or to things that the halacha says, this you can do, this you can't do. That's an enormous amount of information that if it were that simple, Michael, then the whole Gemara should be reduced to just a simple thin volume. There's either a yes or a no. There's no in between, because you're not going to get very far if you say, you're right, a person should lend, no question about it, and he shouldn't get the benefit of the loan. There's no question that is what the halacha tells us. But the halacha also tells us that under certain circumstances, that benefit is not considered to be ribbis because of the circumstance between the love and the malva. And that's where the question comes in. Is it really ribbis? Or is it, we can get by and say it's not ribbis. So while you, Michael, would like to sort of not have that gray area and say, no, it's got to be, or it's not got to be, there's no question, the Gemara doesn't really lend itself to that. And therefore, we we allow certain leeway, if you will, that the lender can. And again, you see that Chazal interpret loans into sales to make it not look like ribis at all. And you're going to argue, wait a minute, it's not a sale, it's a loan. But yet the Chazal they say, wait a minute, the fact that you have done it this way, I can interpret it as being a sale and there's no ribis. You wouldn't like that because to you, it's not a sale. And I agree with you, it's not a sale. It's an imputed sale, just like Bechiras Chametz is an imputed deal, and you're going to look at a scans to say, is this really a deal? I mean, what's going on here? But the Chazal say that we're going to create a way. Otherwise, Chametz B'Pesach would become impossible. I mean, people would totally have a great loss because everything they own has to be thrown away. And the Chazal don't want to do that. They don't want to give everybody a loss by saying that there's not a way that you can keep your chametz, and it's not chametz of a Pesach. Again, one example. So, in your view, you probably, do you feel that chametz b'Pesach is something that is okay? Because you might say, listen, that's just a sort of a sleight of hand, is what people call it. But it's a real sale. But at the same time, there's a wink, wink in the sale. Now, you might say, wait a minute, that's not what Chazal wanted. Chazal didn't want there to be an area where someone can do something and violate the halacha. It's called a Shavuot of Pesach. The teretz is that the Chachamim knew that we were just humans and that we needed to have ways of doing the mitzvah and not being totally compromised. So they figured out ways that we shouldn't be compromised even as we're doing the mitzvah. I think that's really kind of the way we have to.
I think I would like to have Michael on my side if I ever had a din Torah.
Right, Michael.
You're hired.
Michael,
I like the black and white,
black and white
clarity of it,
right.
And all the issues that it basically says. Forget about it. It's not to be viewed that way.
Right.
I think it's amazing how sophisticated the thinking of the Chachamim were when they analyzed all this stuff without the benefit of what we know today.
Yeah. But let me say just one thing in final. When we have a din Torah, then the din Torah, we say that it should be a court of equity, not a court of law. What does that mean? Not strictly saying black or white, but understanding the parties and understanding the circumstances around the parties. Even today in our courts, when a judge hands down a decision, I can't say with certainty that decision is strictly according to the letter of the law, because there's equity involved. In halacha, we call it pshara. You reach some kind of an understanding. In a court situation, most of our courts, while they're considered courts of law, are really courts of law and equity. Is that it's up to the judge to look and understand the principles. Now, when we have laws, for instance, in the criminal sphere, that give the judge no leeway, and we say, this is the law. You do this, this is the law. You do this, this is the law. And it's explicit. That doesn't give the benefit of any leeway. But for the most part, most laws have an inherent built-in opportunity to sort of have some wiggle room. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the wiggle room that and this stems, of course, from the times of the Gemara, because this was a concept that predates any of our laws, is that there was a certain rachamim, there was a certain mercy, there was a certain understanding that the Rebbeinu Shalom was not exacting from us every last ounce of our flesh, but that there was the ability to sort of make some kind of a compromise that would allow the halacha to stand, but give you the benefit. And that's, Michael, I think, how you have to approach this. From your standpoint, you're talking black and white. I'm not going to argue with you. Black and white is black and white. But most halachas are not black and white. Most halachas are meant to be interpreted in a way that I wouldn't say to make it fast and loose that you should have every opportunity, but certainly when there is an opportunity logically to interpret something in a certain way, then Chazal will want to do that. And the halacha, even today, Shulchan Aruch, is also based on the halacha with the equity understanding what may be permissible. Is a certain leeway given? Or if there isn't, then the Chazal are not going to find a way to make something a heter that's isser. But when there's a way to sort of extend it a little bit, then I think that's what the halacha is all about. Anyway, it's a fascinating discussion, and there's again, there's no right and wrong. It's just this is the way Chazal approached the Gemara, and if you're of a position to say, but it shouldn't be that way, then of course, I mean, you can certainly argue that and say it shouldn't be that way. But the Chazal said that that's how we're going to allow it. And we see, again, we're going to see it further next week, is that even when everything is said and done and the deal is done, we still reach back and say, wait a minute, there are kinyonim that superseded. Where does that come from? In this particular case, the buyer paid him back, the deal is over. It's not over because he made a kinyan. Where does that come from? He made a kinyan. That's a different halacha. The halacha is that a kinyan supersedes even this kind of circumstance. So if you made a kinyan kli or a kinyan hagbah, then he's gold. He's good.